Fort Independence sat in defiant solitude on the edge of a barren plain, its rust-streaked walls a testament to human tenacity. To the settlers, it was more than a mere colony. It was home, the last vestige of Earth's spirit in the vast emptiness of the galaxy. Inside the command post, Captain Nathaniel Carter leaned over a holographic map, his weathered face etched with focus. He glanced up as the room's steel door slid open, admitting Sergeant Hector Ramirez and Private Michael O'Donnell. Ramirez, broad-shouldered with grease-streaked hands, carried the smell of burnt circuits and solder. "Power grids are stable, Captain, but we're running low on spare parts. That freighter better show next week, or we'll be patching wires with duct tape." O'Donnell, younger by decades and sporting the fresh-cut uniform of someone new to the frontier, carried a notebook filled with historical sketches and designs. "We've faced worse odds before, sir. The Alamo, Gettysburg. History lessons won't stop plasma bolts, Private," Carter replied, though not unkindly. "What's the status on perimeter defenses?" "Functional but outdated," Ramirez cut in. "The automated turrets are 30 years behind Empire tech. Anything heavier than infantry will blow through us like paper." Their grim analysis hung in the air like a storm cloud. Moments later, a klaxon shattered the quiet. "Unidentified vessels inbound," the automated voice declared, robotic yet urgent. Carter's jaw tightened. "Battle stations." Now, the three men burst into action, joining the rest of the colony's defenders. Within minutes, Fort Independence buzzed with organized chaos as settlers armed themselves with rifles, grenades, and the meager defenses they had managed to scrape together. From the observation tower, Carter stared through binoculars at the descending enemy dropships. Sleek and metallic, they shimmered like predatory birds against the planet's pale sky. When the first of them landed, disgorging ranks of Empire soldiers in shining armor, the captain's stomach clenched. These weren't just raiders, this was an invasion. A voice crackled over the colony's intercom. It belonged to the Empire's commander, dripping with arrogance. "Humans of Fort Independence, surrender now and spare yourselves the indignity of annihilation. Your resistance is futile. Your weapons are relics of a primitive age." Carter grabbed the transmitter. "This is Captain Nathaniel Carter of the United Colonies. If you think we're just going to roll over, you don't know us at all." The enemy's response came swiftly. Plasma bolts screamed through the air, slamming into the colony's walls with devastating force. The defenders returned fire, but their bullets and rockets barely scratched the Empire's shields. Carter watched the battle unfold with a grim sense of inevitability. His men fought valiantly, picking off a few overconfident Empire soldiers, but it wasn't enough. Their defenses buckled under the assault, and Carter knew they had to fall back or risk complete annihilation. "Pull back to the canyon," he shouted into his radio. "Cover each other and regroup." The retreat was chaotic but effective. Ramirez and O'Donnell took up the rear, covering the fleeing settlers with bursts of gunfire. By nightfall, the survivors had reached the rugged hills that bordered the colony. Exhausted but alive, they set up camp in a natural cave, its entrance hidden by dense foliage. Around a makeshift table lit by dim lanterns, Carter convened his senior men. "We can't hold Fort Independence with what we've got," he began. "The Empire will wipe us out if we try to take them head-on. We need a new strategy." "Guerrilla tactics," Ramirez suggested, his voice steady despite the fatigue etched into his face. "We hit their supply lines, sabotage their equipment, make them regret coming here." O'Donnell hesitated, clutching his notebook. "I might have an idea," he ventured, his tone uncertain. Carter raised an eyebrow. "Let's hear it." The young private flipped open the book, revealing a detailed sketch of a Gatling gun. "There's an old one in the Colony Museum. It's not operational, but if we can modify it." Ramirez interrupted, incredulous. "A museum piece? Against the Empire's plasma rifles? Are you serious?" "I am," O'Donnell replied, his voice gaining confidence. "They rely on precision and overwhelming power, but they're not prepared for sheer volume of fire. A Gatling gun's speed and adaptability might just catch them off guard." Carter studied the drawing, his expression unreadable. "You really think you can make this work?" With Ramirez's help, yes, O'Donnell said. We can modernize it. Replace the hand crank with a motor. Use hybrid materials for the barrels. It won't be perfect, but it'll be something. The room fell silent. Finally, Carter nodded. Do it, but keep it quiet. The fewer people who know, the better. By the next morning, a small team had slipped back into the colony under cover of darkness to retrieve the Gatling gun. The relic was heavier than O'Donnell had anticipated, its brass barrels dulled with age. Ramirez muttered curses under his breath as they hauled it into the hidden base. But his curiosity was piqued. As the others slept, the sergeant and the private began dismantling the ancient weapon. Ramirez's expertise in engineering meshed with O'Donnell's historical knowledge, and the two worked through the night, their progress slow but steady. Carter watched them from a distance, his thoughts heavy. He had seen too many wars to believe in miracles, but something about their determination sparked a flicker of hope. When morning came, the Gatling gun sat partially assembled on a workbench, its potential still unrealized. Carter approached the pair, his voice gruff but encouraging. Keep at it. If this thing can give us even a sliver of an edge, it'll be worth it. Outside the cave, the distant hum of Empire patrols reminded them of the urgency of their task. Carter knew the enemy wouldn't rest until every last human was crushed. But as he looked at the makeshift lab and the men pouring their souls into an impossible idea, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The cave smelled of oil, sweat, and the faint, acrid scent of plasma burns. Ramirez was elbow-deep in wiring, muttering curses as he adjusted the outdated motor on the Gatling gun. O'Donnell sat beside him, reading from an old manual and cross-referencing the design. Carter stood nearby, watching with a sharp eye, his fingers twitching toward his sidearm at the slightest sound of movement outside. The first few days had been filled with uncertainty. They had worked in silence, knowing that time was against them. Every hour spent in the cave, every piece of technology they scavenged, meant another hour the Empire had to tighten its grip on Fort Independence. You sure this thing's gonna work? Ramirez asked, wiping sweat from his brow. I've never seen anything like it. This is ancient stuff. O'Donnell looked up, his youthful face betraying no hesitation. It'll work. We just need to adapt it. Rebuild it with what we've got. He held up a small piece of the original weapon's frame, now reinforced with strips of alloy scavenged from the colony's scrap heap. The barrels are fine, but the cranking system is too slow for what we need. I was thinking about using an old fusion battery from the power plant. Should give us enough juice for sustained fire. Ramirez frowned. The fusion battery could overcharge if we don't modulate it. It'll fry the circuits. We'll add a regulator, O'Donnell replied quickly, his voice gaining confidence with each word. I've been studying the Empire's tech. Their plasma guns have a feedback system. I can integrate a similar mod. Carter leaned against the cave wall, arms crossed. He had been skeptical at first, but after seeing the young private's determination, he had decided to give him space to work. This kind of ingenuity wasn't something they could afford to ignore. Make it work, Carter said quietly. Time's running out. Ramirez grumbled under his breath, but didn't argue. If this thing's going to be our miracle weapon, it better damn well work, O'Donnell. The next few days passed in a blur of soldering, scheming, and constant tweaking. O'Donnell and Ramirez often clashed over details, but there was a quiet respect between them. O'Donnell's intellect was undeniable, but Ramirez was the practical one. He knew how to make things last under fire, how to make them function when everything else was falling apart. The modifications were coming together. The Gatling gun had been completely stripped down and rebuilt with all the components they could spare. A lightweight motor salvaged from an old mining rig, custom-built circuit boards for power modulation, and, finally, a new barrel cooling system made from an old refrigeration unit. It was rough. Nothing about it looked sleek or polished, but the gun had potential. As the last piece was snapped into place, Carter entered the dimly lit workshop, the shadows of the cave stretching long behind him. His boots crunched over the rocky floor as he approached the Gatling gun, its imposing barrels now gleaming in the weak light. "How's it looking?" he asked. O'Donnell stood back, wiping his hands on his fatigues. "It's ready for testing," he said. The motor's synced, and the ammo feed's operational. We'll need a good firing range to really see if it holds up under pressure. We don't have that luxury, Ramirez said, standing up from his crouch. We've got what we've got. We test it here. If it blows up in our faces, then we know not to use it. Simple as that. O'Donnell's eyes narrowed. We're going to have to test it against something. We can't just guess if it'll work in battle. Carter exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. He had seen too many miracle weapons that turned out to be duds in the heat of combat. We don't have time for a luxury test, he said. We're going to have to use it. The Empire's coming sooner or later, and we need every advantage we can get. The tension in the room thickened, but O'Donnell nodded, his hands shaking slightly as he set the ammunition into place. Fine, but we make sure it doesn't get away from us. We'll fire it at some of the old supply crates near the perimeter. We'll know if it works or not. Ramirez nodded. Right. We can't afford any mistakes. By the time night fell, the group was in position, carefully hidden on the outskirts of the colony. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of dust and damp earth, the steady hum of the wind the only sound in the air. Carter and Ramirez crouched behind a stack of crates, their eyes scanning the horizon. O'Donnell stood several meters back, positioning the Gatling gun with precise, deliberate movements. The first few shots were tentative, a stream of small, measured bursts that sent the gun's barrels spinning with surprising speed. The old weapon roared to life, its mechanical whine a defiant shout in the still night. The first set of crates was shredded within seconds, their wooden walls torn apart by the sheer volume of fire. O'Donnell leaned into the trigger with a sense of satisfaction, watching as the projectiles punched through the targets with alarming accuracy. But there was no time to celebrate. The weapon hummed loudly, and Carter's eyes darted to the horizon. They'll hear that. Move the gun into the trees. Quick! Without hesitation, O'Donnell jerked the lever, disengaging the Gatling gun from its firing position and scrambling toward the cover of nearby trees. Ramirez and Carter scrambled to assist, their nerves frayed from the tension of the test. Before they could reach the cover, a pulse of bright light split the dark sky, the unmistakable glow of Empire scout ships on the approach. The team froze for a second, caught between the certainty of the gun's success and the looming threat of discovery. That's it, Carter whispered under his breath, a grim smile crossing his face. We've got them now. In that moment, the ragtag team knew the stakes. The Empire was no longer just a threat, they were a target. And for the first time in days, the humans of Fort Independence had a weapon to fight back. The Empire's forces moved like a storm, relentless and unforgiving. The hum of their hovercrafts grew louder as they descended upon the colony's outskirts, their sleek forms cutting through the night sky. Carter, Ramirez, and O'Donnell crouched low behind the trees, the heavy hum of the Gatling gun still ringing in their ears. They had done all they could to hide their movements, but the gun's roar would not be so easily forgotten. Carter's mind raced. He had spent decades in the field, fighting wars where the odds were always stacked against him. But this was something different. The Empire's technology was far beyond anything they had. Yet somehow, the old Gatling gun had offered a glimmer of hope. They had to make that hope count. All right, Carter whispered, his voice low and steady. We move out in 5. Ramirez, you take point. O'Donnell, stay with the gun and cover us. We'll need it ready to fire at a moment's notice. O'Donnell nodded, sweat beading on his forehead as he adjusted the Gatling gun's aim. The hybrid modifications they had made were untested in battle, and its power source was a fragile thing. Too much use, and it would burn out. But they had no choice. This was it. The first Empire mech units emerged from the horizon, their massive exoskeletons lumbering with mechanical precision. In the distance, their plasma rifles glowed faintly, their eerie light illuminating the night like fireflies. The Empire was here. We need to buy time, Ramirez muttered as he peered through the scope of his rifle, eyeing the advancing troops. If we can draw their fire, maybe the Gatling can make a difference. Carter nodded. We draw them in close, then hit them hard. Don't wait for the perfect shot. Just keep them busy. Ramirez gave a sharp nod. Got it. The plan was simple. but there was nothing simple about it. They knew the Empire's approach was methodical, calculated. Two things that worked against them. Their goal was to unsettle the enemy, to break their focus, even if just for a few precious moments. As they slipped through the trees, Carter could hear the Empire's soldiers shouting commands to each other. Their voices clear despite the distance. They were confident, too confident, walking right into a trap. Carter's heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve never wavered. This was their home, their last stand. There was no going back. "Let's move," Carter ordered. They split into two groups, Ramirez and Carter moving ahead, while O'Donnell followed with the Gatling gun. The plan was to lure the Empire forces into a narrow ravine where they could be surrounded, trapped in the kill zone. From there, the Gatling gun would make its mark. As they crept forward, the sounds of the Empire grew louder, until they were within striking distance. Carter signaled to Ramirez, who ducked behind a rock formation, his sniper rifle ready. O'Donnell, with his hands shaking slightly, set the Gatling gun up on a high perch, the barrel slowly rotating as the motor hummed to life. "On my mark," Carter whispered. Then the first Empire soldier appeared in the ravine, his silhouette sharp against the dark sky. Carter's pulse quickened, but he remained still. As more soldiers filed in, the trap was set. "Marked," Carter barked. In an instant, Ramirez fired, his rifle sending a single, deadly shot that pierced the lead soldier's helmet. The explosion of the soldier's body sent shockwaves through the Empire's formation, and panic rippled through their ranks. Without missing a beat, O'Donnell yanked the trigger on the Gatling gun, the roar of the old weapon filling the air like a thunderstorm. The first burst shredded through the nearest group of soldiers, their bodies falling in an instant. The Empire scrambled, deploying energy shields and drones to return fire, but the human colonists were already on the move. Ramirez's sniper shots picked off soldiers hiding behind rocks, while Carter led a charge toward the Empire's weakened lines. They were overwhelming them with sheer unpredictability, using their environment to strike when the Empire least expected it. O'Donnell's Gatling gun hammered away, spitting fire as the barrel spun at a breakneck pace. Each shot felt like a victory, each burst of fire a testament to their resilience. The weapon had come alive, just as O'Donnell had hoped. It was not a perfect machine, but it was effective, and in that moment, it was the only weapon that mattered. "Keep pushing," Carter shouted, his voice cutting through the din of battle. They were winning, against all odds. The Empire's forces, once so sure of their superiority, were faltering. They couldn't keep up with the unpredictable tactics of the humans. As the remaining soldiers retreated, their drones falling one by one to the precision of Ramirez's shots and the relentless fire of the Gatling gun, Carter allowed himself a fleeting moment of triumph. But they weren't out of danger yet. The Empire wouldn't just back down. They would regroup, reinforce, and come back with greater force. They needed to move fast, before the full might of the Empire's wrath descended on them. "Get to the secondary base," Carter ordered. "Move now." The men scrambled to retreat, but as they did, a massive explosion rocked the ground beneath them. Carter and Ramirez hit the dirt, instinctively rolling to cover. A new wave of Empire soldiers had arrived this time, in full force. Armored mechs, far more formidable than the ones they had fought before, strode across the battlefield, their massive feet shaking the earth with every step. The Gatling gun sputtered, the motor stuttering as its power source began to flicker. O'Donnell cursed under his breath, his hands flying over the controls, trying to stabilize it. But there was no time to fix it. The Empire had the upper hand again, and without the gun's constant fire, they were vulnerable. Carter's eyes narrowed. They had already fought back an entire invasion with ingenuity and sheer willpower. Now they had to do it again, this time with everything on the line. They had no choice but to fight through, to stand firm. He turned to Ramirez and O'Donnell, his voice low but steady. "We're not done yet. Let's make this count." The battle was far from over, but they had proven one undeniable truth. The Empire had underestimated the power of human resolve, and they would never make that mistake again.